Guitar motivation. Today, what we're going to be doing is talking about hand and wrist and thumb placement when you're playing guitar. And this came about yesterday. I saw a post on social media of somebody who was very frustrated and looking at quitting guitar because they weren't sure exactly how to approach this sort of thing. And let's be honest, I mean, you don't know what you don't know, especially when you first start learning how to play. So I thought today it would be really good to talk about some fundamental elements to help this person and anybody else that might need this help. So I've got a camera rolling in the back here that's going to show where my wrist and my thumb and all that sort of thing is, and I'll kind of move back and forth between those as we talk about this. So the first thing I want you to think about before we even get to any of this is I want you to think about how you're sitting with the guitar. Now, what I mean by that is you might need to elevate your leg up a little bit more to get the guitar into a comfortable position. Needless to say, we are all built differently, and so you need to find what works best for you. I'm going to give you some suggestions, but that doesn't mean that's the only way that's going to work for you. The most important thing is that you just think about these things and explore what's going to work best for you, okay? So as I'm sitting here, you can't really see it, but my leg is a bit elevated up in the air, and I like to do that. If I was sitting like this, the guitar feels too low and it wants to fall off my leg. So if I prop that up, now all of a sudden that guitar kind of sits in the right position. And the other thing that I do is that once that guitar is sitting there, I tend to squeeze the back of the guitar like this into my body, okay? Which again, solidifies the guitar so it's not going to fall anywhere. But the other thing it does is it pushes the guitar neck out a little bit so I have a little more room back here to work with the things I'm doing. I tend to tell students, don't think of the guitar as being straight across your body like this, simply because then this elbow is way out here and this elbow is way back here, like you're running somewhere. Where if I kind of squeeze like this, the body into my body, my elbows are kind of side by side where they should be. Okay. Now, again, you got to explore this and see what works for you, but that's what works for me. So elevating the leg a little bit, maybe a lot, depending on what's comfortable. Squeezing that into my body a little bit to give me security so the guitar isn't going to slip anywhere. And it also pushes that neck out a little bit. And then the last thing is thinking about the angle at which the guitar neck is sitting. Now, again, if you were sitting like this, it makes trying to do things on the guitar even more difficult because the neck is sitting at a slope. So I don't really sit straight either. I tend to have the guitar neck up a little bit. And you can watch, some of your favorite, teachers or players or whoever it is and see how they sit as well and kind of go against that and figure out what works best for you. But having the guitar neck up a little bit makes it a little bit easier for me to reach the things that I want to do. So that's step number one, is just thinking about how you're sitting there. Step number two then is going to be the arm and wrist placement onto the guitar. And this is going to change depending on what chord you're playing or whether you're playing chords versus scales. And we're going to talk real quick about all of those things so you have a better idea of what I'm talking about. So let's start with just some plain open chords. If I want to play something like G or C or D, something like that. So the first thing to think about is where your wrist placement is going to be and then where your elbow placement is going to be. So if you think about it, if I was grabbing onto a ball, for instance, okay? So if I do this finger's on top, this finger's on the bottom, okay? If I transfer that idea over onto the guitar, okay, there are some things that this might work for. But there are other things where if I take that and instead of holding onto that ball, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my elbows inward, as awkward as that looks and feels, right? But that's what you're doing is if I turn that elbow in, what it's then doing is kicking the pinky upward. You see? So now all four of my fingertips are kind of sitting at a level here, right? It doesn't matter, if this is sitting straight up or down. What I'm looking for are my fingertips because my pinky is pretty short. So if I need to do something where I need to reach with my third finger or my pinky further up the guitar, I'm going to have to think about turning that, which means that now it's just not a matter of where the wrist is. I also have to think about where that elbow is going. You see? So let's talk about the wrist and the elbow in a real sense here. So if I went to a G chord, for instance, regardless of how you play G, if I'm playing this G chord and I take my wrist, for instance, and I do this is one thing that people tend to do a lot, is they grab onto the guitar. Why? Because we grab onto things. That happens, okay? So if I grab onto the guitar neck like this, The problem is, okay, is that my fingers can't reach as far. There isn't as much flexibility. They're not going to be able to reach as far this direction, and they're not going to be able to stretch out very well. Where if I take the wrist and I lower it down, now again, if I turn that elbow in a little bit, which is why I'm grasping and I have some extra room right here, okay? If I turn that wrist downward and I turn that elbow inward, notice how it pushes the pinky upward versus putting the elbow out and then turning the wrist up. You see how I lose all of that ability of being able to expand my fingers when I do that. Now, I'm not saying one is right or wrong. It depends on what you're trying to do and how comfortable it is for you. I can very much remember being a kid trying to learn how to play from this angle. Again, I didn't know what I didn't know. So as I was trying to play this, and my fingers are fairly short, so this was very uncomfortable trying to play all, especially like a C chord. It was just really uncomfortable. So when I learned how to take the elbow and move it inward, it gave me a lot more ability, especially if you look at the C chord, for instance, where the third finger's on the fifth string. Now, the chords don't matter. You can do whatever. But if I turn the elbow out, it becomes very difficult to try and reach. If I turn the elbow in, okay, I have more room to reach that third finger up. So as I play chords, for instance, G and C and D, what you'll notice is the elbow is just kind of moving around, making adjustments. Now, I've done these chords many, many times, and so it kind of happens out of automation. Now, I could, in theory, sit and hold everything in one place like this, and I probably could still do okay with that. But it's not comfortable. So I'd rather find what works for each chord and then just kind of readjust. So let's talk about this wrist here. Now, there are times, for instance, if I was making a D chord, where I probably could do just fine doing this grabbing onto the guitar like this, and the D would work just fine, okay? So if that's something that works for you on certain chords, then that's great. But you have to be ready to do something like G, where now the wrist is going to have to drop down. So my point is if you think about how you're holding the guitar, you think about where your wrist is and where your elbow is as you're making these chords, and think about these three things working together. Where is the guitar neck in terms of comfortability? And then where does your wrist need to go and your elbow need to go to make this as comfortable as possible? Now, needless to say, when you first start learning how to play guitar, and even further down the line, there are lots of things about the guitar that can be very frustrating, and you have to do them over and over and over to develop them. There's an element of muscle memory and a thought process that has to happen. There's I have all kinds of videos at GuitarZoom and on social media about all of this sort of thing, but that takes time. But if you don't think about the comfortability of the way that you're sitting and the way that you're approaching these things, you could be just kind of beating a dead horse with this sort of thing. I always tell people, think about the fact that the guitar should be sitting in a comfortable place for you to play. Like, you don't want to have to morph around this guitar because it's sitting a certain way, and now your shoulder is in a bad spot or whatever it might be. You want to put the guitar in a place where it's just fairly straightforward for you to just come and approach that guitar and then start doing what you need to do, doing all of your rudimentary stuff or memorization stuff or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So think about that when it comes to playing chords. Where does your wrist need to be? Where does your elbow need to be to make that comfortable? For instance, now we'll move over to a bar chord. So if I was making a bar chord, if I'm sitting like this, there's no way I'm going to be able to make that bar chord. I need to lower that wrist down. The other thing is that I want that first finger to be fairly straight. I don't want to be facing this direction. I'm actually facing a bit inward, okay? So the elbow is coming in, which is, again, kicking these fingers upward, which gives me more room to reach underneath there, you see? So that's something you have to think about as I play. Now, as I move up the guitar, obviously my elbow's going to start running into my body. So I'm only going to go up so high, which is why we would maybe learn another kind of bar chord, because once we get this high up on the guitar, maybe we start playing some bar chords on the fifth string. And then when that gets too high, maybe we learn how to play some on the fourth string. There's a lot of things that you can do to make sure that it's comfortable. Now, if I was standing up, it's going to be an entirely different experience. But let's stay with sitting down at this point. So let's move on to scales. Now, for me, there's two different kinds of scale positions. there's what we'll call what I call a closed position and an open position. So a closed position for me is going to be more like a blues position. So if I went in here and I was going to start doing something bluesy, okay, now my reach doesn't need to be as wide. I need to be able to grip more for things like bending and, vibrato, that sort of thing. So what happens there is my wrist tends to come up a little bit more. I'm not sitting down like this like I was on a G, okay? Because when I do this, again, it's hard to do, for instance, again, you could look up these videos, but if I was doing a bend, for instance, I'm grabbing onto the guitar, my thumb is pressing down, and my fingers are turning up like this. So they're working against each other, holding that guitar neck stable as I bend that string. So the thumb needs to be up to be able to do some things like that. And then all of a sudden, if I need to move into what I'll call an open position, where I drop down and I do something where I'm going, now I need this stretch, so my wrist drops down into this position, okay, to be able to do that. And as you're playing, you can very much move from you can move back and forth between those two stances, if you will, with your wrist and your elbow. You can shift back and forth between those the more you practice them. Bottom line here is that things are going to keep moving depending on where you are this way and what kinds of shapes you're making, whether they're chords or scales or whatever you need to execute. You need to be thinking about these sorts of things because everything doesn't just happen in one stance on the guitar. It doesn't work that way. So hopefully that helps you a little bit in understanding how this works. If you're looking for more information, please do me a favor, go to GuitarZoom.com, check out our All Access membership, and certainly like, share, and subscribe on whatever social channel you're on. I would sure appreciate that. And have a great week. Keep practicing, stay positive.